Have you ever been at work and felt like everyone else is acting from a script that you don't have, and any minute it's going to be your turn to speak, but you have no idea what you're supposed to say? Maybe you felt like you aren't good enough for your job or not good enough to pursue your dreams beyond work. If you often have thoughts like, everyone here is smarter than me, or people are going to find out that I don't deserve to be here, or I've accidentally tricked people into thinking I'm smarter than I am, and it's only a matter of time till I get caught, then this is the episode for you. This week, I'm talking with Dr. Kristin Yates about an issue that plagues many of us: imposter syndrome. We talk about why we have thoughts like these, how to stop them from running our lives, why just trying to change your thoughts doesn't actually work a lot of the time, and how playing will literally make you feel more confident at work. But first, let me tell you a bit more about Kristin. Kristin Yates is a board-certified OB/GYN physician, author, and life coach. She hosts the podcast Imposter to Unstoppable, which normalizes the experience of imposter syndrome among physicians and all humans, really. She is co-author of the book The Chronicle of Women in White Coats 3, and she creates adventure retreats that help professional women regain their confidence and find balance through play. With that, here is my conversation with Kristin. What is imposter syndrome? Give us a definition to get us started.
So the way I like to think about imposter syndrome is the thought or belief that you have not earned any of the accolades or accomplishments that you would ever have, or it's this belief that you are definitely the imposter, you are definitely a fraud, and it's only a matter of time before someone figures that out.
So clearly this is like career related. Career is all over this. Can it show up in other areas of our life too?
Definitely career. And I think I talk to a lot of women, so I see it a lot with motherhood as well. But it really can show up in any aspect of your life. But I think career is probably where it can be the most detrimental for people.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so walk us through a little bit more of what this experience is like. What does it feel like to be someone who's suffering with imposter syndrome, maybe in the workplace? I know you talk a lot with doctors, so maybe even just from that perspective, like what does it feel like to be a doctor in a room with imposter syndrome?
It's so internal, and it's associated with a lot of shame. So what imposter syndrome feels like, or it sounds like, is a little voice in your head that's telling you you don't really know what you're doing. Someone's going to figure it out. You're definitely going to mess up. You don't belong here. It's this constant chatter of doubt, basically, of self-doubt. And how that can manifest in reality is by constantly second-guessing your diagnoses or the work you do, a presentation you do, a talk you give. It can mean that you don't apply for a job, maybe. It could mean that you never stand up for yourself or you never talk in meetings. These are things that how it would show up in the day-to-day life. One thing I'll say, I don't want to forget to say it, is imposter syndrome was coined as a pathological thing back in the 70s. And the more that I learn about it and talk to other people about it, the more I'm convinced that it's not a syndrome at all. Like, imposter syndrome makes it seem like there's something wrong with you if you have it, or if you have these thoughts of self-doubt. And what I want to make very clear off the bat is that these thoughts of self-doubt, this imposter syndrome, is a normal experience for humans who have a working human brain, meaning every single one of us. It just comes with the territory, especially in certain times of your life, like in a transition, or if you're being challenged or growing in some way. And I think that the more that message can be put out there, the less stigma we will attach to the self-doubt, and the more we can talk about it. One more thing to say to delineate the difference between imposter syndrome that's normal, that all humans experience, and then there are certainly some people who suffer and struggle because of imposter syndrome. And I am one of those people. Several years ago, I almost had to quit my job because of it. It just felt like such a heavy burden. But what I'll say about it is there are some people who are more prone to having negative impact on their life, like depression, anxiety, burnout, so on and so forth, than other people who can just hear the self-doubt and ignore it.
Yeah, I like that you're making that distinction there because maybe it is just a really natural part of being a human and being a beginner. If we are a beginner, then we, of course, are not someone who's as knowledgeable in, say, a career that someone has been in for 50 years or something. But maybe there's what you're saying is some people, it's not just, oh, I feel like a beginner, or maybe part of me feels a little bit nervous because this is my first presentation, but it could actually start hijacking your system for some people and essentially be making decisions for you because you're choosing not to stand up and voice your opinion. You're choosing not to speak. You're choosing not to put yourself in positions or in more positions of authority.
Exactly. It's basically the difference of there's lots of voices that happen in our heads, right? We all hear different voices in our heads from time to time, and this is normal, how our brains function. And the difference is that there are some people who allow the self-doubt to be the driver of their life and make their decisions for them and keep them held back and prevent them from moving forward and growing. And there are other people who learned not to do that and can have the self-doubt in the back seat as a passenger, a very annoying one, but not the one making decisions in their life.
Yeah, I like that you said learned too, because that might mean that someone taught them how, or they were in a situation where it was modeled for them. And for some other people, maybe they never saw a different way. And it sounds like almost self sabotaging, right? Because at some point, I don't even want to be in the room anymore because I'm not worth being here. And so it's making those decisions for you and it's removing you and also reinforcing the idea that you shouldn't be there. So it must get even stronger every time it comes up and you sort of lean into it.
Exactly. And it's one of those things where the brain loves habits. It likes to do the easiest thing. So what that means when it comes to things like imposter syndrome or thoughts of self-doubt is that the more you allow them to be the boss and the more you listen to them, that's actually fueling that neural pathway so that it continues to happen over and over again. And over time, that becomes your brain's default. So you walk into a new situation or you have a meeting with your boss or you open up your email and the immediate thought is, I'm definitely getting fired. They know that I'm not good enough. And what happens is people don't realize that the only reason why that is the automatic thought is because they've thought it so many times. And what happens is people then assume that since it's the automatic thought, that it's the truth. When in reality, it's just a habit and habits can be changed.
Yes, I really like that you've said the thought seems familiar just because you've thought it so many times, not because it's necessarily true. And maybe it's something that you were told a while ago. It likely makes sense where that came from. It's not like you were like, oh, I know it would be fun. I'll start doubting myself, right? You were likely in really unsupportive environments at some point in your life where that voice got fed. And so it makes sense why it's happening, not because it's true, but because there's a reason for it in your past or in some other coping mechanism that your brain came up with at some point. And it's also interesting because it's creating like a self-judgment over your competency or your ability. And it's linking, like you said, shame with your intelligence or your ability. Because what if you can't do something? What if you really don't know the answer? Why is that wrong? Why does it mean you don't belong, right? Because imposter syndrome becomes aligned with knowing everything all the time.
Yeah, exactly. And perfectionism, which is another way to say fear of judgment or failure, because what happens all the time and what comes up for people is that they hang on subconsciously to their imposter syndrome or their self-doubt because they think that it's preventing them from messing up or from becoming too arrogant. So there's this weird attachment to their self-doubt where it's making them miserable. They don't like doubting themselves all the time, but there's usually this subconscious belief that if I didn't have it, then I might turn into a cowboy and do crazy things and really mess up. So it is this very interesting link there.
That's so interesting. And it's again like this self-preservation tactic. And like I like to say, some of our coping strategies are smart. They just have the wrong information, you know? Mm-hmm. That kind of makes sense, but some of the information is wrong. And so it's not like your brain is stupid doing all these things. It's of course still trying to protect you. It's trying to make sure that people don't think you're arrogant, but that's not what happened. That's not, the lines are blurred there. They've been crossed. So I'd also love to talk about the different kinds of imposter syndrome, because for me, I learned recently that one type of imposter syndrome is thinking that you sound smarter than you are. Because when I thought of imposter syndrome in the past, I was like, oh yeah, it's like when you're in a room and you don't know what to say and you're worried someone's going to ask you a question. And I'm like, no, I don't have that. Like, I'm fine. I can talk about whatever. But I actually am worried that people think I'm smarter because I do know what to say, and or I can figure out something to say that make it so I don't sound like an idiot. And I was actually talking with my husband about this kind of recently, and he pointed out to me, he's like asking me to explain this. And I shared, well, no, I often can think of the right words to say to make it sound like I'm smart, but I'm not. I'm just saying the right words. And he was like, well, Hannah, if you know the right words to say, then you know. I was like, oh, wait a minute. Have I been smart this whole time? And I've just been worried, right? We get these weird like ideas in our head and they just go wild.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good example of the different types of imposter syndrome. I think are people have different limiting beliefs about themselves or things that are not necessarily true, but that hold them back, that are typically formed during childhood. And I think the different types of imposter syndrome are different flavors of that, where some things are going to feel more triggering based on your background than other things. But essentially, your brain just is going to come up with scenarios to make something make sense to you until you say it out loud to someone else. And they're like, I don't know about that. That doesn't seem right, which happens to all of us because to our minds, like it all makes sense in there until we say it out loud. And then we're like, oh, okay, I guess there's some displaced logic there.
Yeah, that doesn't actually follow through. Okay, I've just been living my life like that for decades, but okay. So you've mentioned that you had really significant impact in your life from this imposter syndrome in the past. So how did you get from feeling like an imposter to feeling unstoppable?
Well, it's definitely an ongoing journey. I think that there are certainly moments, because I'm human, that I still have a lot of self-doubt, and it's sneaky. It can come up in different ways now. It's more clever, but it's not like you can forever banish self-doubt to the curb. It just doesn't happen. And I don't want anyone to think that getting out of imposter syndrome means that you never doubt yourself. That's normal. And I actually now find that I use my self-doubt as a guidepost to tell me that I'm heading in the right direction, because it means that I'm growing. So that's been a great reframe. However, that took me 4 years to get there. So it's not like one day I walked in feeling like I wasn't good enough, and the next day I'm like, oh, everything's wonderful and unicorns. It took time. What happened for me, it was definitely always someone who had thoughts of self-doubt that were just kind of simmering under the surface without my recognition. And then the transition for me from graduating residency to becoming an attending physician was the real trigger that the burden of the self-doubt felt so heavy. It was there all the time. And interestingly enough, I didn't know that's why I felt the way I did. I thought it was because of the job or that I really was the imposter or everything. And I just didn't have the background knowledge of our thoughts create our feelings. Our thoughts are constant. I didn't know. I didn't have any awareness of my own thoughts for a long time until I was 30 at this point when I figured this out. And it was actually through weight loss, like weight loss coaching and figuring out, oh, I have these thoughts that tell me I want to eat this chocolate, but I don't really want it. And then I was able to use the same tools to uncover the thoughts of self-doubt. And when that happened, it was so interesting because it was just the same thought I was having over and over again. And it became kind of like a little bit of a letdown. Like, really? It's just this one thought that I have a million times a day and I'm feeling this awful because of it. But what that meant is it was really easy for me to change with the tools from coaching and that kind of thing. So from there, it just became one small step after the next. And I would take one slice of my life. Like I had a lot of dread about before being on call. I was constantly worried about it for 2 days before being on call because I was worried I wouldn't know what to do. And so I took that one scenario of my life and I focused on it, and I was able to eventually reframe it in a way that I didn't feel the doubt anymore. And I really struggled with the arrogance thing. I think many women do. I think that's a society thing. So many women are scared to come off as too arrogant because we're told that we shouldn't be. So what happens is, instead of being arrogant, we are self-deprecating and we have a lot of self-doubt. And that was a struggle maybe a year in, where I realized that I was still hanging on to a self-doubt and this self-deprecation because of a fear of arrogance. And then once I realized that arrogance is totally different than confidence, it's two separate playing fields. Arrogance is, I'm amazing and I'm also way better than you and I always will be. That's arrogance. Confidence is, I recognize my value and my imperfections, and I want you to also recognize your value at the same time. So you can't be both of those things at once. And it's just the nature of the type of person you are. It's not like a continuum. So that was a distinction that it took me a while to learn. But once I figured that out, I said, oh, I can just be confident and I don't ever have to worry about being arrogant, because that's just not the type of person I am. That doesn't resonate with me. So that's been the journey. And now it's just one step in growth after the next, with self-doubt by my side, basically.
I am so glad that you made that very eloquent distinction between arrogance and confidence. Especially, as people who are socialized as women, we are told from childhood, when we show any sense of self-assuredness or confidence or directness, to not be arrogant, when that's not even what we're doing. And so it's linked up in our subconscious. Like we were saying just a minute ago, it's not that you randomly had this idea about maybe I don't want to be arrogant. It has been hammered into us for so long. Like, these thoughts don't come from us usually, and they might be running the show afterward, but they often don't come from us to begin with. And when we're thinking these thought patterns, we can end up functioning from that place without realizing it. And I also saw something recently that said, your thoughts create your feelings, but your nervous system creates your thoughts. And I really liked that, because there's so much nuance with a lot of thought work where we could just be, without realizing it, thinking these things and maybe looking at it. And like, that's one step. Maybe that's enough for a lot of areas of our lives, just to have the awareness of the thoughts. And also, if you're someone that's been working at thought work, you're not broken if it isn't the thing that's fully shifting what's going on for you. Because like we've said, it's probably like you got these thoughts from something a long time ago, right? Or societal conditioning or societal pressure. And sometimes our nervous systems are the ones that are running the show behind all of it too. So one other thing I really liked that you mentioned was, specifically in the field of medicine, it's, quote, normal that it's a high pressure situation. And it sounds like it's a justification for a lot of people who are working in medicine to feel that pressure and think, this is just how I'm supposed to feel. This is how residency is supposed to feel. You're supposed to be burnt out. You're supposed to be burning at both ends. Are you the one broken, or is the system broken in that case?
Yeah. And you've put my soapbox like directly in front of me now, because this is
please take it, please.
This is a battle that I have decided to wage recently, because you're absolutely right. I think that this medical system is designed to keep anyone who works in it feeling less than, and they are definitely benefiting from our doubts and people pleasing and perfectionism. There's no doubt about that. And when you're talking about nervous system, and that's really important, because we all experience a variety of trauma. And we talk about trauma, big T trauma, little t trauma. It's all of it. We all have some aspect of it in our life. And there are certainly things that thought work isn't going to help you uncover. And what happens is, there are things in your life that are a trigger because of trauma that was emotionally traumatic for you in the past. And that creates a nervous system response, fight or flight or fawn or freeze, right? These things automatically, my heart is racing all of a sudden. I'm feeling flushed. Something's happening. I don't know what it is, which your brain does not like. So then your brain has then to create a story around it, which if you are someone who is used to doubting themselves, that's just the easiest place to go. So then what happens is it becomes this vicious cycle of anxiety, worry, rumination, self-doubt that kind of all comes together. And it can be difficult and take different approaches to uncover all of the different triggers, some of it being trauma, some of it being thoughts, and so on and so forth. When you put someone in a system like the medical system, where they're conditioned to fear imperfection and ignore human things like hunger and thirst and going to the bathroom for years and years,
sleep
and sleep, that is trauma. And I think that finally people are starting to realize that. But what happens is then we become, it's like the analogy of a fish doesn't know it's in water. We don't know. And everyone just goes along with it. And it feels too scary to do anything differently because we're too scared to do a disservice to our patients. So it becomes a huge issue where that is a nervous system response. And if you're in a similar situation, even if it's not medicine, this can happen in any industry, depending on where you're working and the kind of environment you're working in, if it's toxic or not. What happens is that you have to address the thoughts and bring some awareness to the thoughts, but you also need to work on what I call, or the term embodiment, meaning what's going on in your body, because usually that's the first thing, meaning someone says something or you feel like, oh, I feel like this heaviness. I feel this dread in my body. And for many of us, we're so disconnected from our bodies that we don't even know that. And you really have to work with both of those things at the same time to work towards deconditioning.
Yes. We just need a moment of silence for that. That is, thank you. Thank you for saying that. I love this soapbox that you are on. And yeah, I love the way you said our thoughts are trying to rationalize what's going on behind it. And yeah, for a lot of people, we look at this self-improvement space or self-development space, or you look on Instagram and you see all these affirmations you should be writing on your mirror, and you should just be saying these things to yourself all the time. And when it doesn't work, it's not the affirmation's fault, it's your fault, because this is what's working for everyone else, supposedly, on Instagram, right? And so then we start thinking, am I just so fucked up that the thing that's supposed to help me isn't even good enough?
Yeah, this comes up a lot, and I call it what I call phase 1 and phase 2 of personal development or personal growth, self-improvement. And what happens is phase 1 is you were like, oh my gosh, my thoughts create my feelings. This is so amazing. All I have to do is just change my thoughts and then my life is going to be perfect. And that works for 6 to 12 months, maybe. And then people get into phase 2. And phase 2 is exactly what you're talking about. All of a sudden, shit gets real and life happens, and you can't change every thought because of trauma or conditioning or a variety of other reasons. You can't change the thought. That's not going to work anymore. And then what happens is that there's all of this self-judgment on, why can't I just change the thought? I know all the things the gurus are saying. I know what to do, but it's not working. I'm a failure. And when we get to phase 2, many people feel worse than they did at the beginning because we are really, really good at judging ourselves, really good at it. And it's so subtle. It's like, I'm just annoyed that I can't change the thought. Why can't I fix the thought? And over again, I'm having to remind people and myself, why don't you just get curious about it? What can this show you? It's a different level of work. Nothing has gone wrong. You've picked all the ripe fruit, and now you have to wait for the fruit to ripen. And that's called embodiment, integration, curiosity. But judging yourself is what gets a lot of people into trouble, because that feels so bad, and you are then become the victim and the victimizer, or the person who's doing, like, you're blaming yourself and you're also the one feeling like crap. And it's an awful place to be in.
Yeah, it feels so hopeless and isolating. And I believe, and I think you might agree, there are no such things as negative thoughts. You said guideposts earlier. Your doubts are guideposts to where you need to lean in. And it's funny, I've used that same term myself a few times of a negative thought is not something to get rid of. It's a guidepost to where I need to look at myself, to look at a part of me that needs validation or love or compassion or all of these sorts of things, right? Just it's showing me, oh, I'm really afraid to give this presentation. I'm afraid to walk into this boardroom, and then asking why with curiosity, not with accusation, but getting curious about why am I afraid? And when I'm in a space, you don't always have to be in this space. It's fine if you aren't in every moment. But when you're in a space of having compassionate curiosity for yourself, it's kind of hard to be mean to yourself when you're realizing that you are feeling fear. You are feeling afraid. Why would we then just kick ourselves while we're down and say, well, it's your fault. It's your fault that this is happening. And that's a lot of what the subtle or not so subtle messaging of some of these spaces is, well, we've told you how to do it. It's your fault that it's not happening then.
Exactly. I love that you said curiosity. It's like my favorite reminder because the richness that curiosity can bring us to our growth and also the amount of compassion and love we can have for ourselves and how deeply spiritual this whole process can become when you're willing to lead with curiosity, especially for yourself.
Yeah, that's a life-changing shift. So let's start talking about, we've talked a lot about doctors. I remember I was talking with someone once where he was sharing that he had an extremely traumatic event happen in his life, a significant loss in his life while he was in medical school. And the medical school ended up expelling him. And it was a completely, at least from what I've heard, an unfair experience this person went through. And he had identified so strongly with becoming a doctor that he didn't actually even know what to be doing in his life anymore, because that became like it wasn't an option because he filed this lawsuit against the school and it became this whole thing. And so when you've talked in the past about identity balance, having a balanced sense of identity, I'd love to hear what you think about that and how it could be a breeding ground for imposter syndrome when you put all your eggs in one basket of I am a doctor, or I am a mother, or I am whatever it is. When we fully identify ourselves with those, what do you think happens with the imposter syndrome if it's already been bubbling up?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely causes it to increase because what happens is when our ego is so attached to one identity, then what happens is any possible threat, like a negative review or someone making an offhand comment that you took wrong or something, anything like that that could potentially threaten that identity gets blown out of proportion. And meaning it's filled with a bunch of fear and anxiety and rumination. And that's where self-doubt lives too. It's all the same location in the brain, basically. So it all kind of comes as a package deal, a wonderful package deal. So when it comes to identity, and my lens here is definitely a spiritual one, meaning I have an ego. It's useful for my life in this journey. I have what I think is I have a purpose to fulfill. And I can do that through many channels. It can be done through my work as a physician. It can be done through my work as a mother. It can be done through my work as someone who goes to the grocery store. It doesn't really matter what I'm doing. It just matters that I am who I am. I have fully accepted who I came here to be. And that requires really a lot of unlearning. Like for me, I thought that in order to have value, I needed to be smart. And that's how I ended up being a doctor because deep down, I mean, I like what I do, but to be honest, the first inclination of me wanting to become a physician in college was because of ego. I wanted people to think I was smart, and smart people become doctors. So that's what I did. And this is all unconscious. I had no idea why I was doing this. So that was an identity that I had to separate from myself, because I realized that I became addicted to proving this identity was important, or it became so out of balance that other parts of me were gone, like the ones that like to have fun, or the ones that like to be at home with my kids or spend time with my husband, because that became the most valuable identity. And what I was able to do, and I'm still working on, of course, is realize that any ego identity I have is really irrelevant. And the most important thing that I have to do in this life is figure out who I am at my core and be that person in any context that I'm in.
Gosh, hearing a woman say that makes me so happy. That makes me so happy. I'm so glad that you are on that path, not only on that path, but holding up your light so that other women can find it too. That's so powerful. And yeah, when you said you wanted to become a doctor because that's what smart people do, and you wanted to essentially receive validation and belonging and people's acknowledgement of your worthiness through that avenue, the issue is not that you wanted to feel worthy or belonging, right? It's just that we get out of whack of where that comes from. Mm-hmm. And becoming a doctor, there are so many ways that could end, right? And it could be completely out of your control why that would end. And then what? You're no longer worthy. You're no longer admired. You're no longer loved. And so what you're saying of bringing those feelings back to just who you are, just you being, and you being as you are a doctor, and you being as you are a mother or a wife or going to the grocery store, when it's just coming instead from just you existing, and then that filtering through the different roles you're playing. No one can mess with that.
Exactly. If I'm willing to courageously validate myself every single day, no matter what, then no one can take that from me. Right. Mm-hmm. And so that's what I rely on now, is my own validation of how I show up. And that means some days I don't show up that great, right? I'm not the best mother or the best listener or whatever, but it doesn't mean that I need that someone else to validate me. It means that I decide that my value comes from inherently being here alive on this planet today. And I will choose to validate myself every day that same way. And when you have that level of personal power, it doesn't really matter how you are perceived, how your identity is perceived in any other aspect of your life.
Yeah, that's the real stuff right there. And I appreciate that you said on good days and bad days, because you can feel really worthy and your worthiness is maxed out. And you could feel really unworthy one day and your worthiness is still maxed out. Like, you feeling less worthy one day doesn't actually change anything. So we don't even need to pressure ourselves to constantly feel like I'm a badass bitch every single day. No one's going to feel like that. And it doesn't change the fact that I am a badass bitch every single day.
Exactly. That's spot on. Yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned play. Let's talk about play, because I know this is something you're excited about too. And I very much am. I'm an Aries, so I am here for the playfulness. Why are play and fun so important, especially in this topic?
So play and fun, I'll get a little bit nerdy on you for a second, but when we talk about from a neuroscience perspective, and I will not bore you with the whole neuroscience lesson, but essentially there's two hemispheres of the brain. I'm going to really simplify this. The left hemisphere is typically the logic, the policies, memorization. It's the part that the school cares about. It's the part that society cares about. The problem is that the left hemisphere is also where the self-doubt, the judgment, the comparison, all that lives, basically. The right side of the brain, the right hemisphere of the brain, is the present moment, the creativity, the thinking in colors and shapes. And it's the love and connection and play and fun. And clearly it's undervalued in our society, the right hemisphere of the brain. What I realized is I wanted the right hemisphere of my brain to be where I function from most of the time. And the reason is that I want to be present with my kids. I want to be connected to my patients. And that doesn't come from the left hemisphere. It comes from the right hemisphere. So one way, the easiest way, and I think the best way to do like a right hemisphere workout is to play more. So I figured out how to play again. I forgot it after a decade or so. I figured out, what do I even do to play as an adult? And I did those things and I practiced that. And the more that I can function from the right hemisphere of my brain, like we do when we're playing and having fun, the easier it is for me to connect there at work or in a stressful situation. And what that means is I show up differently in those circumstances. So that's anecdotally how play has been so important to me. But come to find out, scientifically, the reason why this happens is because when we play, we are triggering certain neurotransmitters that feel good, dopamine, serotonin, that kind of thing, to be released. And when these neurotransmitters are released, they improve the function of the part of our brain that is the logical part. So actually, translated means that when we play, we get smarter, we get better, we get more innovative at our jobs. And when we play, it's also the quickest way to trigger neuroplasticity, which of course we all like because it keeps us forming new connections in our brain, learning new activities, getting better at skills that we want to work on and that kind of thing. So many of us as adults think that play is like this thing that we get to do once a year on vacation, but actually play is a homeostatic process for humans. And what that means is it's regulated where you have to have it. Like you have to have food and sleep. You need these things. These are under homeostatic balance. So is play. So if you're not playing enough, then there are problems like depression, anxiety, overwhelm, burnout, that kind of thing. That's a scientifically proven fact.
That's amazing. It's so cool that you're articulating something that I think a lot of us intuitively know, but we've been told it's not true so many times that we're like, oh, right, no, it's not important. I'll wait till the weekend to have fun. And it's funny because it would be funny if it isn't so sad that we say all the time, like kids learn through playing. It's not kids learn through playing. It's people learn through playing. But we've been told we have work to do, so we can't.
Exactly. And this is another soapbox we can probably get on, right? Is about how society has put value on the wrong thing. And now there's just so many people who believe it that we all believe it. And it takes a rebel to stand out against that. And I love that you mentioned there are some things that we intuitively know. And I just say I would encourage everyone to listen to that because your intuition doesn't doubt itself. Your intuition isn't people pleasing. It's the one true thing that you can rely on. So I think that's always the thing to settle on and realize that's the thing you should be listening to.
Yeah, that's so important for sure. Yeah. And we could get on and on, I'm sure. Maybe we can have you back someday to talk about the difference between anxiety and intuition, because that's something I have my own soapbox about. I think I have about 1 million soapboxes. That's one of them.
Same. Yeah.
So when we talk about playing, I don't have any children yet, but I have some nieces and nephews and I have fun with them. But when they want to play, tea party, I am actually not having fun. So can you talk a little bit about, are we supposed to have fun the way that kids have fun? So when you say play, like someone listening is like, okay, I'm going to play with my kids tonight, and they try and it's miserable and they're doing some imaginary game that they're not into. Is there something wrong with that person? What's going on there?
Yeah. Here's what I'll tell you. Don't play with your kids. Okay. Like, I'm just going to say that playing with your kids is not fun, at least for me. Like, that's never going to be something that I'm like, oh, I'm going to have fun. Let's go, children. No. Okay. So if you're just starting out in the play thing, don't play with your kids. I actually want you to completely ignore them. Okay. In a safe way, because that's not fun. I mean, yes, there are some people who are like, oh, I really like playing Barbies. Then fine, do that. But just because it says play with your kids, it's not play. Play means you can forget where you are and you're laughing and it feels like time has just gone by and you don't know where it went. Things like playing or playfulness would be like, to adults, for me, it's like putting on my favorite song from when I was like a teenager in my car and dancing to it. Or playing for me is riding my bike by myself around the neighborhood, like not with my kids. I'm like, bye kids, I'll be back. Or it's when I speak at conferences, I'll make the guests play red light, green light with me because that's just something that's silly and fun. It could be coloring. It could be building something. It could be playing an instrument. It looks different on everybody. Go back to your childhood and say, what did I like doing as a kid? What was fun for me then? And just try that out and see if you like it. You can't do it wrong. And there's lots of different things you could do to play. I love riding go-karts or going zip lining. So that's more of like an adventurous play. I also really like to color. Oh, not with my kids, again, because then they want to color the same page as me. So really allow it to be a personal adventure and experience for you to figure out what feels playful to you. And you'll know when you're doing it. If you're not enjoying it, it's not play.
Yes, I appreciate everything that you said. And I'm sure there are a lot of listeners that are just sighing with so much relief at the idea that it's not supposed to be fun to play with their kids all the time. That's just called parenting. And if you try to do it with your kids, not only are you going to feel like a failure at having fun, you're also going to be a shitty parent because you aren't enjoying it. So just don't even go there. Yeah. So let's talk about how we could start exploring some of these concepts on our own. We've already talked about play a little bit. Let's go back to imposter syndrome. What are some ways that we can start moving beyond this, or maybe getting curious with ourselves around? And let's talk about both as a whole, if you're someone that's feeling like you're impacted by imposter syndrome, but also like in an acute, maybe flare up. I'll put quotation marks around that. But when you're acutely feeling like the heat and the heaviness of imposter syndrome in a moment. So maybe the acute sensations and then also like a broader spectrum of exploring.
So I like to call what you're describing the self-doubt spiral, because it really is like that. It's a moment and then it becomes a visceral experience. Your heart is racing, your palms are sweating. You can't focus on anything except for not messing up. In that moment, you have to calm your nervous system. You have to get the parasympathetic nervous system back online. So what I like to recommend in those moments is something called deep, slow breathing, which is when you take intentional, deep breaths, like to the count of 6, where you're filling your lungs completely up, holding it and letting it out. And what that's going to do is it's going to turn up the volume of the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the rest and digest. We probably remember that from high school science. When you activate the parasympathetic nervous system, it's naturally going to calm down your heart rate. You have to address the visceral response first. You can't think your way out of self-doubt when your heart is going 200 beats per minute. You cannot do that. So get yourself out of sympathetic mode by taking deep breaths. And then you're going to say something like really simple to yourself. I guess this is an affirmation, but it really is just, I'm doing the best I can, or I'll do the best I can. Something like that. Something just to get your brain out of the spiraling of self-doubt. And then the most effective thing is to focus outside of yourself, meaning whatever you're doing, you're usually doubting yourself because you're going to be giving a presentation, or you have to perform in some way, or someone just triggered you. Something happened, probably with someone else involved. So if you can ask yourself, how can I best be of service in the moment? What that does is it turns off your ego, which is what basically has gone rampant. Your ego is terrified, which is what it does. But when you focus on service, which is what we really all at our core want, we really want to be of service to other people, then you have given your brain something productive to do instead of critique and judge yourself. Deep breaths, get yourself out of sympathetic nervous system response, a little affirmation just to turn off the noise, and then ask your brain a good question like, how can I best be of service right now?
I love this idea of maybe even just going off to the bathroom before the presentation, doing some slow breaths in a place where you won't feel like anyone is looking at you. And as you get to know yourself more on this journey, you're going to start to realize what things work best for you as well. And so say, for example, you know that you are someone who really loves touch. Maybe your love language is physical touch. And maybe even giving yourself a hug. Like that sounds corny, I know, but like sort of crossing your arms and having each hand on a shoulder and just gently squeezing down your biceps, down to your elbows, to your forearms, to your hands. This is also going to be like helping your body get out of this freak out mode for all the science that I cannot explain why, bilateral stimulation or something like that. I don't know. I was the English major that took science classes for non-science majors, but it feels good and it works. So that's why I do it. And so maybe you're someone that likes touch, maybe having the affirmations. If you're someone who's like words of affirmation, maybe that's even the most impactful thing to you. Maybe having like recording a voice note to yourself of like when you're feeling good and confident so you can listen back to it, or have a friend do the same thing. Like, hey, can you just write something or send me a voice note that's like super peppy and like, you got this, and I'll listen to it if I need it. And so just giving yourself this toolkit for going into these situations so that you have things to lean on instead of just thinking, I need to think my way out of it. Mm-hmm. So thank you, Kristin, for saying that, because when you're in it, you're so in it and you need to get out of the pit first and then move forward.
Absolutely. Those are great tips. I love those. And then for the long-term self-doubt, I think this is where, as you mentioned, Hannah, it's the curiosity. It's, people don't love journaling, but I think that's one way to get these thoughts that you're unaware of out on paper. And what I think is the most useful thing to do is make a commitment to just for a week, becoming aware of the moments where you feel doubt in your body, or you feel uncomfortable. Maybe you don't even know what the feeling is because you're not used to thinking of it like that, but you're feeling uncomfortable. Get to the point where you know what doubt feels like. I feel it like in my shoulders. There's this heaviness there. My heart does speed up a little bit. And then you commit to marking in time when you had that physical response during the day. And then the journaling, it's very pointed at those moments of, okay, let me go back there when I felt that. When I felt that, what was I thinking? When I felt that, what was going on? And if you do this over a period of a few days, what I bet you'll find is that it's just a few thoughts. It's just a few triggers that are doing it constantly. It's likely not 150 different things. It's probably like 3 to 5 that your brain's just recycling because it knows what to do. And I think that's the first step, is awareness of what is doubt? What does it feel like? And then focusing on getting the chatter out of the mind into paper and then evaluating it from there.
Thank you for that. Yeah, just getting it out in front of you to see it. It sounds simple, but it can be really profound and shifting. Absolutely. Awareness is powerful. So those are some ways that we can support ourselves. How can we heal this trend, this systemic issue within our communities?
Talking about it, vulnerability. I think that's been the most powerful thing for me, is the more that I talk about my self-doubt to people who I trust, I get it back so much more. People are like, I thought that was just me. I thought I was the only one. Thank you so much for sharing. Vulnerability in a way that makes you feel safe. It's helpful for you, but I guarantee you it's helpful for the person you're sharing it with, because they probably have been wanting to feel seen and validated in their same experience.
Yes. Yeah. And especially if you identify with a group of people that is getting the brunt of it, right? Mm-hmm. Like women in medicine. Maybe you don't go to a male boss that's been saying misogynist comments and share that with him. But if you say it to another person that you trust, that you feel safe enough to share that with, so often it's not what's wrong with you. It's, oh my God, there's nothing wrong with me because I feel that way too.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah. And so what sort of outside of ourselves and community, like what are some external resources that we could explore in this area?
I think it depends on how you like to learn. Luckily, I think for us right now, there's a million. I'm a reader, so there's books to read about it. I love podcasts too, of course, listening to podcasts about it. I think that right now, one thing that if you're looking for it, you will find community out there. And then just listen to what resonates with you and forget the rest. If you're ever reading something or listening to something or watching something that makes you feel like you're doing it wrong, then stop. Because like we mentioned earlier, there's a bunch of different angles to take, especially with regard to self-doubt and imposter syndrome. So I think pick a few things that resonate with you and stick with those.
Yeah. If any self-improvement technique is making you feel like there's something wrong with you, ditch it. Like, run.
Yes, absolutely.
It is never you. And I say that with, of course, the caveats of like, if you're wanting to heal internalized oppression, internalized racism, or whatever, you're going to feel uncomfortable. There's a difference between feeling discomfort with growth, but like feeling like, oh no, this is not right. This isn't right. Listen to that, like you said. So what's a message that you have for someone who is listening to this episode, who is feeling that unburdening of, oh my God, I'm not the only one, but maybe isn't sure where to go with this yet, or maybe this is new for them, or maybe it's not new. They've been struggling with this for decades. What's a message that you have for someone who's listening and is really feeling it?
I would encourage you to approach yourself with curiosity and love. And if that has not been modeled for you, then what I will tell you is that it's going to feel weird at first. It's going to feel weird to talk to yourself like you're the inner child. It's going to feel weird for you to talk to yourself like you're actually your best friend because you're so used to being critical. But over time, the more you can bring curiosity and love and compassion to your own inner work, the more beautiful the journey becomes, even in the hard moments, because you realize that it's all part of it. It's all part of the experience that we have of life. And it helps you to not take yourself so seriously. So the other thing I'll say besides curiosity is dedicate some time this month to doing something fun and being playful, because it will give you a window into that connection to something more out there, like nothing else can.
Thank you. I love that. Kristin, how can we follow along with what you're doing in the world? Where are you?
I am mostly on Instagram. You can find me at Kristin Yates DO. I also have a podcast that I took a brief hiatus from, but I'm ramping back up. So that's Imposter to Unstoppable. It talks a lot about my particular experience within medicine, and I interview mostly physicians, but the topics are human topics. So you can definitely check that out. It has specifically about imposter syndrome and self-doubt, but we talk about a wide range of things like we mentioned here today. Those are probably the best ways to find me.
Yeah. And like I said, could never be a doctor. I'm so glad that there are people out there that have brains that work like that. And Kristin's podcast is amazing, even not as a doctor. So please check it out. And we'll include that in the show notes for sure. Thank you so much, Kristin. This has been, I can't even believe we're doing this. We're recording this at night, and my brain normally is off once the sun sets, but I am like rejuvenated just by this conversation. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. It was really fun.